Well, hello everybody. It is good to see all of you on this Sunday afternoon. I hope that you all are doing well. It looks like a bunch of you have already jumped into the chat. That's great. Nicole gets the points today because she got here first, or at least was the first person to talk and say that she got here. So congratulations, Nicole, on that. Hey, thanks for spending part of your Sunday afternoon with me. Kevin says hello. Kathy says hello. Sarah's here. Uh, it says Beth, but it says hello from Noah. Hey, Noah, good to see you here. Chris is here as well. Kelly is here. Dan is here. Dan is here. There you go. Dan and Dan. Aaron is here, and Bob and Sandy are here as well. Hey, good to see all of you on a beautiful day. Yesterday it was a little bit like living in Florida. And if you're anything like me, you are very anxious for fall. But I will take a day like today. It's absolutely beautiful outside. We continue to be kind of in this interesting time, obviously, with everything else going on in the world with the pandemic and things like that. We've kind of slowly begun to reopen things and whatnot, and yet at the exact same time, there's still a lot of caution. There's still not a lot of people that are ready to fully go back right now. And so it was both exciting and a little bit like longing for me. I was preaching at the Oak Hill campus this morning, and one of the services was fairly full, and one of the services was not really full. And I don't say that to like highlight attendance or anything else like that, but I say that in a sense of just like longing for the day when we'll all be able to be together again. And partially that's a like when we can go back and there's not like masks and not 6 feet, and I can hug people and give people handshakes and things like that. But also, like, there's a whole entire crowd, a whole entire community of disciples that we have never been able to worship with, that we're going to spend all of eternity worshiping with, which is a pretty cool and amazing thing when you actually give it some thought. And so, like, this morning made me anxious for that day. Like, I know that we're all really excited about getting back whenever that day comes and worshiping in a little bit more of a regular setting. But man, think about what eternity is going to be like and what worship is going to be like there, and the people that we're going to see and the congregation that's going to be there and being face to face with Jesus. It just reminds me, just how much we have to look forward to. Hey, Willie. Hey, Ron. It's good to see you. Soap guy, I saw you this morning. Yeah, it's coming, right? It's coming. That's what we get to look forward to. That's truly what we're called to set our eyes on each and every day as disciples of Jesus. That bigger picture. So just something that was sticking in my mind this morning. We are continuing in our study on 1 Samuel. I'll bring my slides up, and we're in 1 Samuel chapter 22 today. Last week was kind of an interesting discussion. Also, sorry, before I get into things too much, my voice was going like before I recorded stuff for online worship this week. And so after talking all morning and things like that with people, my voice is a little bit weak. So if it sounds raspy or something else like that, I apologize. I'm doing the best with what I have. I'll probably be drinking more water this morning on stream, or today on stream, but it's good. God gives me exactly what I need for the moment that I'm in. But we are in 1 Samuel chapter 22. It was an interesting discussion last week because we kind of saw David take an interesting step in the greater conversation of him following God and what that looks like. And so often he's been the poster child of what it looks like, and he should be if he's someone called a man after God's own heart. And yet at the exact same time, it was kind of like a little bit of a letdown. We got to see David give into fear in a lot of different ways. We got to see him struggle in a lot of different ways. All that stuff came out last week. And we kind of wondered how things were going to go this week, right? It just kind of, there was this hanging feeling of what was going to come next. And this week is going to be a little bit interesting. So to recap a couple things for you, David is on the run. He is out of the nation of Israel, so he's trying to get away from Saul and things like that. He has just run into the priest, Ahimelech, and he has said, hey, I'm on this secret mission and things like that. This is what happened in chapter 21. I'm on this secret mission, and nobody knows about it. And as a matter of fact, I wasn't even able to grab a sword. And so do you have bread and do you have a sword? And so he gets the sword of Goliath from the priest Ahimelech, but there's this other guy, the chief herdsman of Saul. His name is Doeg the Edomite. I don't know why that's such a memorable name to me, but Doeg the Edomite is one that I, just for some reason, from the first time I heard it, I can never forget it. There's another one that we're coming across today as well, and I'll let you know when we get there. But Doeg the Edomite is there, and he sees everything that's going on. And I said last week that's going to come back to bite David a little bit. So that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about today, as well as seeing just how everything plays out. David's still though on the run, and we're going to talk more about what happens with Doeg. But before we do that, please bow your heads and let's have a word of prayer together. Lord God, we thank you for the gift of your mercy. We thank you for your constant work in our lives. In moments where we struggle and in moments where our eyes are firmly fixed on you. You know our frailty, you know our struggle, you know our sin, and yet you love us just the same. God, as we dig deeper into Daniel's life today, David's life today, as we wrestle with the decisions that he made and how they came back a little bit, and also look at the anger of Saul and contemplate our own anger. God, I pray that you would lead us and guide us by your Holy Spirit. Speak through me. Let my words be your words. Let this time be for your glory. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So, we're going to get right into it. A little bit that happens in 1 Samuel chapter 22. These are the big things. David runs to a cave and then back into Judah. So he's going to go out to a cave, he's going to go around a couple different places, and then he's going to go back into the land of Judah. So he's going to actually go back into Israel before all is said and done in this chapter. And then David is going to gain a very powerful following in this chapter as well. This is kind of the beginning of the significant rise of David, aside from whatever Saul has given him. Remember, everything that David is up to this point in time, he has gotten in relation to Saul. He killed Goliath, and then he gets promoted. He becomes this musician and everything else like that. All of that in connection with Saul. Now everything he has is going to be kind of on his own with the help of God, obviously. Saul is going to go on a rampage and kills priests and families. We're going to get into what that looks like in a little bit. But David's grip on the throne the whole entire time is going to get stronger during this chapter. This is a very, very significant chapter. The tides turn in a lot of different ways in this chapter. Things begin to fully swing over to David's side in a lot of different ways. And David is solidified in his relationship with God. And let's dive into that. Hi, Diane. Good to see you from Colorado, checking in. We're going to start by reading the first 10. We're going to do this like last week, even though it's a longer chapter. We're going to do this just in 2 sections, and so 2 banks of questions for discussion and things like that. I'm going to read the first 10 verses for us. Y'all know this by now, or at least I'm assuming most of you know this by now. I'm reading the New Living Translation. And so if you're in a different translation or something else like that, if something stands out, feel free to ask the question. But at the exact same time, if you want to follow along exactly with me, I'm in the NLT. So here it is, 1 Samuel 22, verses 1 through 10. So David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Soon his brothers and all his other relatives joined him there. Then others began coming, men who were in trouble or in debt or who were discontented, until David was the captain of about 400 men. Later, David went to Mizpeh in Moab, where he asked the king, "Please allow my father and mother to live here with you until I know what God is going to do for me." So David's parents stayed in Moab with the king during the entire time David was living in his stronghold. One day, the prophet Gad told David, "Leave the stronghold and return to the land of Judah." So David went to the forest of Hereth. The news of his arrival in Judah soon reached Saul. At that time, the king was sitting beneath the tamarisk tree on the hill of Gibeah, holding his spear and surrounded by his officers. "Listen here, you men of Benjamin," Saul shouted to his officers when he heard the news. "Has that son of Jesse promised every one of you fields and vineyards? Has he promised to make you all generals and captains in his army? Is this why you have conspired against me? For not one of you told me when my own son made a solemn pact with the son of Jesse, 'You're not even sorry for me.' Think of it, my own son encouraging him to kill me as he is trying to do this very day." Then Doeg the Edomite, who was standing there with Saul's men, spoke up. "When I was at Nob," he said, "I saw the son of Jesse talking to the priest Ahimelech, son of Ahitub. Ahimelech consulted the Lord for him. Then he gave him food and the sword of Goliath the Philistine." Okay, yes. So those are the first 10 verses. I'm going to get to your question here, Kathy, in just a second. Thanks for asking that one. That's a great question. But let's dive into it. David moves on from his hiding spot, really, to a large cave known as Adullam. I'm going to show you where that is on the very next slide. Not only do down and out people join him, or I should say not only do his relatives join him, but down and out people join him as well. But so not only do down and out people join him, but his relatives do. And this was likely because Saul is hunting down all of David's family, okay? This gives full legitimacy to David running out in the last chapter. He needs to get out of town, and he needs somewhere where his family can be safe. So notice the ripple effect, though. When David leaves, if Saul is truly angry, he's got to watch out for his wife. He's got to watch out for his brothers. He's got to watch out for his parents, his aunts, his uncles, all of those people. Because back then, if you were trying to make a power grab, if you keep reading in like later parts of 1 Kings into 2 Kings, things like that, you'll notice this in the nations of Israel and Judah, because they end up splitting. When someone wants to take over the kingship, they try to kill every last remaining relative of the person who was king, or they try to kill every last remaining relative of the person who's trying to be king. So wiping someone's whole family line out was a very common way to do a power grab back in that day and age. And you can tell that Saul is thinking about it. He's offering Jonathan the kingship. He's offering his officers, vineyards and property and everything else like that. Everything is pointing to a full wipeout of the line of Jesse in a lot of different ways. Okay? So David definitely needs to get out of town, and he needs to get his families out of town as well. So here's, depends on how big your screen is, but you can see a little bit about where everything was. And so if you think about it, Gibeah is right here in this area, all right? He goes to the priests at Nob, David does, right here, passes through Jerusalem, which is not fully an Israelite city at this point in time, but he goes all the way over to Gath. This is where he gets into contact with the Philistines and things like that, okay? That was last week's chapter, the end of chapter 21. Now he's running to the cave of Adullam, which is right here, kind of in the middle of nowhere, okay? So that is where David is this whole entire time. He's hiding in a very, very large cave. It's not a small cave. It's noteworthy that disconnected people are joining David, though. It's a reference to people who are upset with Saul as king, who want David to be king. So there's a political movement that's going on here as well. There are people that do not want David to be king, that do not want Saul to be king, that want David to be king as well, and they're going to rally with David. They were likely fairly down and out, debtors, people that had a record, things like that. It's probably those types of people, and you kind of see that as David's time goes on. Those are the initial types of people that rally around David, and he almost gives them a second chance in a lot of different ways. David travels to Moab, though, to ask for a safe dwelling for his parents. This harkens back to the time of Ruth, though. If you were in worship today, or if you live streamed worship, we talked about Ruth today. That was only 3 generations earlier. So Israelites, particularly people from Judah, sometimes went off to Moab during times of danger, famine, things like that. It was right there. And when I say it was right there, this is what I mean. So this is all like Israelites' territory right here. And here's Moab. You pretty much just need to cross the Dead Sea or move around the Dead Sea, and you find yourself in Moab. Okay? So maybe not as good of a place of Israel as Israel, but it's nearby and it's a safe place. And being on the other side of the Dead Sea, it had a completely different ecosystem and things like that, completely different weather patterns, which is oftentimes, and we see this in Ruth, when there's a famine in Israel, there probably still is not one in Moab, okay? Just because of where it is, where it sits on the mountain ranges of things, how close it is to the sea and everything else like that. So that's where David runs, looking for a place for his family. The prophet Gad goes to meet David, though, and tells him that he really needs to leave Moab. That was likely going to be because he was violating the law by promoting the welfare of the Edomites, specifically because he is the anointed king of Israel, okay? So this is not Israelites cannot go into the land of the Moabites and things like that, the Edomites. Around there, it's even though he's promoting their welfare and things like that, it's more because David is the king, not the other way around. So this is in Deuteronomy chapter 23. If you look in Deuteronomy chapter 23, you don't have to jump back with me. I'm going to jump back just by myself. So Deuteronomy chapter 23, it should say Moabite, by the way, there, not Edomites. I'm sorry. It says, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants for 10 generations may be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. These nations did not welcome you with food and water when you came out of Egypt. Instead, they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in distant Aram Naharaim to curse you. But the Lord your God refused to listen to Balaam. He turned the intended curse into a blessing because the Lord your God loves you. As long as you live, you must never promote the welfare and prosperity of the Ammonites or Moabites. Okay? That's what it says in Deuteronomy. By the way, Balaam, I'm not going to tell you. Someone tell me who Balaam was, particularly about his animals or his animal. If you know, you get extra bonus points today. Why is Balaam an interesting figure in the Old Testament? Throw that out in the chat. I'm going to jump back up to 1 Samuel 22. But that's what's going on. So the prophet Gad meets David, tells him all of those things. David goes then to the forest of Hereth. So it's in Saul's jurisdiction. It's in the land of Judah, but it's largely unpoliced at this point in time. Okay? It was known as an area for the lawless. It was like the Wild West of ancient Israel and things like that. Like there's not anything going on in Israel or in that forest of Hereth in that part of Israel. Okay? Saul has eyes everywhere looking for David, even though he's not necessarily going out to get David. Saul has eyes looking for him, and so he's told that David has returned to Judah, that he's told that he's in the forest of Hereth, all those things. Soap guy gets it. It's a talking donkey. Yep. Willie's got it as well. Had a talking donkey. Absolutely. Yep. That's who Balaam is. Here we go. I know that this is a very complicated picture, maybe is a little bit small for you and things like that. But this tells you a little bit more about how close the lines were. So this is the cave of Adullam, all right? This is where David was, and then he moves to Hereth, okay? So he goes from the cave of Adullam, spends some time in Moab, and now he goes to Hereth. So Hereth is right, I need to get my mouse back. Hereth is right there. So he has just crossed into the land of Judah, and that is where he's hanging out. You can kind of see from the terrain and things like that, it's a mountainous area, a very thick forest there at that point in time and whatnot. And so, yeah, that was what was going on there. Keith, that's a good question. I'm going to get back to that one as well. Aaron's going to try to answer my questions in the chat. But Saul does something similar to what was done in the past with Jonathan. He appeals to tribal affiliation, right? He says, men of Benjamin, right? He's trying to like pull those people together. He also appeals to the wealth and status. I remember he talked to Jonathan about being the next king. I talked about some of those things already, right? He's offering the officers land and vineyards and all this other stuff. He's trying to like play up the fact that people are going to be rich if they follow him as king. And so he says, all of them are conspiring against him, which is not necessarily true. We have absolutely no reference suggesting that the officers knew of Jonathan and David's pact, their covenant, but it definitely would not be a surprise because things are pretty tight-knit in the army in a lot of different ways, especially because the two of them were very much commanders. What's most shocking is Saul claims that Jonathan is actually encouraging David to kill him. Were you shocked by that? Because you should have been shocked by that. It's a very, very just stunning thing in a lot of different ways. There's zero reference to that anywhere, and there's not going to be one because Jonathan never tells David to do that. And it's at this time that Doeg the Edomite chimes in. So he's wise and he's crafty. This is not saying Doeg is a good character, right? He's wise and he's crafty, though, as it pertains to the fact that he waits until this moment. Okay? It gives him extra power and it gives him extra favor with King Saul by waiting to speak until this moment. Saul is at the peak of his anger in a lot of different ways, and now Doeg is going to be the one guy that provides information. His focus is all on himself. Okay? He's playing his cards close to the vest for his own benefit. That is absolutely and totally true. Note, though, that Doeg doesn't tell the full story. Instead, he feeds Saul's ego, likely for his own gain. Like I said, he paints the picture of Ahimelech helping David on a quest to steal the throne. To steal the throne. Yep, Beth has got this absolutely right. Wise and crafty for his own benefit. That's exactly what Doeg does. So he paints this picture that David's on this quest to go steal the throne and Ahimelech is helping him. So think about it. It very much looks like a coup. Right? David has Goliath's sword and he's rallying his family and a group of misfits and he has the backing of the priests. Right? Like, that's a mess in a lot of different ways. Hey, Todd, glad to have you jumping in today. You're in the middle of the thick of a coup, apparently. But yeah, so that is what is presented. That's what's presented to King Saul. That's what Doeg presents to him. None of that's really true. But you can see how it plays into Doeg's hands, right? And for good things for Doeg. Okay, so I'm going to answer some of those questions for you, but here are the questions that I would like you to answer as well. These are a little bit longer, and so I'm going to explain these. Again, you can put 1, 2, or 3 if you want to answer that. Todd, if you're just joining, we just went through the first 10 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 22. So the first question, maybe it's not surprising to see a down-and-out group join David. I talked a little bit about that. Are you surprised that David wants their company, this man after God's own heart, hanging out with down-and-out people? Why or why not? What strikes you about Saul's anger? I know we talk about it almost every single week when we have Saul, right? But what strikes you about Saul's anger this time? And then lastly, I'm going to explain this one a little bit more. Martin Luther says that when God tells us to not bear false witness, so that's the 8th commandment, one of the things that he's calling us to do is to put the best construction on everything. And so, it's when you talk about your neighbor, when you talk about those people that are close to you, he's calling us to put the best construction on everything as we're talking about people. So we tell the story in the best possible light for our neighbor's sake. How does Doeg fail to do that? So Doeg does tell the story, and he tells a lot of things that are true, but he's not putting the best construction on everything. So how do we fail to do that as well sometimes, though, in our own lives? How does Doeg fail at it, and how do we fail at that as well? Like I said, my voice is a little bit interesting today. We'll see how long it holds out. But interested to hear your thoughts on these 3 questions. Kathy asks to explain a stronghold. Aaron, yep, Aaron's got it. A specific fortress or a reference to a geographic area that could be used as a military stronghold. Either way. So a cave could actually be called a stronghold because there might be only one way in. And it might be that it's up in a hill, in connection to a hill. There might be multiple ways in. And it's in connection up into a hill. And so you can hide and also fight and escape at the exact same time. But it's your spot. It's what you're defending. It's where you're living. It's where you are. It's where you make your final stand in a lot of different ways. That was a stronghold. Yep, absolutely. Keith asks, was Ruth as a Moabite able to enter the assembly of the Lord? So that's a very, very good question. And the answer is that we don't have any reference to it, obviously, with Ruth. So we don't know necessarily what Ruth did or didn't do, whether she entered the assembly of the Lord or not. There was sometimes this thought that women were just kind of grafted in with their husbands because they didn't have any property or anything that they owned or anything else like that. And so they just kind of inherited whatever their husband wanted or whatever their husband was in a lot of different ways. And so there could be that reading to it. Largely, though, if you read Deuteronomy, it's no, that she can't as a Moabite. However, notice it. When she says, and I preached about it this morning, I don't necessarily know what Tom hit on over at the Valley Creek campus, but when she says, your God will be my God, she's revoking her Moabite status and becoming an Israelite. She uses the term Yahweh. She is becoming an Israelite in every possible way. That's what Ruth is doing. And so I would say likely she was probably permitted to enter the assembly of the Lord. However, there's also a reason why they might not be allowed to enter the assembly of the Lord. Because she was, though, the reason why I say that she would likely be allowed to is because she's no longer considered a Moabite. She's revoking that in a lot of different ways, and she becomes an Israelite. She becomes a follower of God. She marries an Israelite man twice, actually. She is an Israelite in every possible way. So she is more grafted into the nation of Israel than a Moabite traveling through or something else like that. The opposite side of that is we talked about Doeg the Edomite last week being detained before the Lord. Doeg is an Edomite. He is not an Israelite. So he is also outside of the land of Israel and the people of Israel and things like that. And yet he can be in the assembly of the Lord. He can be detained before the Lord. He can be near the prophets and things like that, even though he's an Edom, even though he's an Edomite and not an Israelite. So you see some of those tensions with things like that as well. As I'm talking Yeah, wow. Only 2 questions here answered so far. Both of them. Question one, I asked, is it surprising that David wants their company? Cassie says not surprised because David has a heart like God. That's a profound answer, actually, Cassie. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for answering it that way. That's a very, very profound. Not to like pat my own wife on the back, right? But that truly is like, so. That's reading into the text with everything that you have. What would the heart of God do? And she's answering it that way. So that's a very interesting take, and I appreciate that. Sarah says David probably wanted support in any form at the time, and even if they weren't specifically for him, like you said, they were probably against Saul, which was also good for David. That is also true in a lot of different ways. He needs warriors. He needs defense at this point in time. He's going to take whatever he can get. We largely can believe that was absolutely true for David. Moving on to, oh, no, Keith also has question one. Keith says, David was considered an outcast, so they all had things in common. David would welcome help. Yep, that absolutely can be true as well. That David is part of an outcast, and so being an outcast, he identifies with the people who are outcasts. Absolutely, that can be a thing. In question number 2, Kelly is the first one that answers this one. She says, Saul's anger seems to be extreme and trying to pull in the sky. An example to show that he's becoming increasingly far from God. Yeah, and we're going to see just how far in the remaining verses of the chapter, okay? So you're absolutely right in that. It's very extreme, pulling the sky, going nuts, he's going off the rails. Dan, you accent this as well. It's based on misinformation, it's wrong thinking, it's paranoia, and largely the misinformation that Saul is... The misinformation that Saul has is his own misinformation, right? Like he's not really getting, the only misinformation that he truly gets in this account is from Doeg, who doesn't share the full details about anything that's going on. All of this stuff that he has about how Jonathan is telling David to kill him and everything else like that all seems to be in his head, the paranoia that's there and everything else like that. It truly is amazing. Cassie says Saul is looking for people to take his side, and he feels like they hid the truth from him, which is only increasing his anger and trust in his own people. Yep, absolutely. He's looking for people to take his side, and he's flailing in a lot of different ways. Beth says Saul's anger can be pretty familiar because being that angry, facts don't seem to matter as much as being right, sadly. I don't know if you meant it this way, but if that's not a comment on our society today, I don't know what to tell you. Yeah, that's how anger works. That's how anger works. When we give into anger, facts don't matter. Being right, having control, being the center, that's what matters the most. And we don't get that in any sort of way from what Saul is going through. Chris says Saul's anger comes across as paranoid. He appears to play the victim here, transferring blame to his son. And how ridiculous is that, by the way? The king of Israel, the appointed king of Israel, is playing the victim. Like there's something wrong with him in some sort of way. Like, oh, poor Saul, right? Like the dude that has consistently gone against God in so many different ways is trying to play victim. And he throws his own son, his firstborn son, under the bus. Like, what? It's shocking to read on the outside. And we know this. Any of us know this if we've given into anger, right? How rational that all seems to be when you're really angry. It does seem to be very rational when you're angry. Aaron says, what strikes me about his anger is that he's completely consumed and hardened by sin. Yep, and we're going to see exactly what that is. Saul has blockaded himself off from God. The only one that exists in Saul's world is Saul. The only thing that exists in Saul's world is power. If he doesn't exist and he doesn't have power, his idols come tumbling down. That's what's going on in Saul's world right now. So, in question number 3, I talked about putting the best construction on things and whatnot, and how Doeg fails to do that, and how we fail to do that as well. Willie, you chime in on this and say that Doeg fails by painting Ahimelech and the rest of the priests in the worst possible light. Yeah, that was one that I didn't bring up all that much, right? Was the priests. But he absolutely does. He sees Saul's anger and murderous intent, and instead of calming his fears, which a wise counselor would do, he inflames them, which is what someone who's prideful and just wants his own thing does, right? That's exactly what Doeg does. This is totally a power play in a lot of different ways from Doeg. Cassie says, we are sinful. We can be like Saul and try to break others down who don't agree with us or who are against us. Absolutely. And sometimes it's a very subtle thing, right? It's a very, very subtle thing. We make a comment out to be more than it actually is. We claim that there's a number of people with us when there aren't actually. We leave out the full statement. We make a negative thing that someone said stronger than it actually was. You know, you can go on and on down the list of ways that we don't necessarily put the best construction on anything. And what it boils down to is lying, right? Sooner or later, that's exactly what it boils down to, is not putting the best construction on things also equates with lying. But here's the thing. When we talk about putting the best construction on things, and Dan, I think you're getting to this. We often tear each other's down thinking we're raising us up. We try to give honor to ourselves rather than God. The idea of putting the best construction on things is raising everyone up, period, and allowing God to get the glory, right? To let the truth stand as the truth, but raising everyone up and letting God get the glory, because we don't know what people are going through, right? We don't know why people reacted the way that they did or didn't react the way that they did. I think about early on when I was in seminary. I was in a congregation and there was a couple individuals who were known for being complainers in a lot of different ways, that nothing was ever right with them, that something was always wrong and whatever else. And I complained one time to one of the staff there about this individual in particular, just shocked at how much negativity was around their life, and then heard their whole entire backstory. And it didn't make what they were saying okay, but it made it understandable in a lot of different ways. And I was able to hear it for what it actually was, because someone actually put the best construction on their story rather than just giving in and things like that. So there is benefit to hearing the best construction on things. It allows us to also see people in the light that we need to see them in. Aki says, Saul twisted facts in anger. Doeg twisted facts to his benefit. Easy to see that in them, but I have done the same. Tell things in a way that makes me look good. We're so good at this. We're so good at this. All of us are. And we're almost taught to do that in a business sense, right? Get ahead, right? Be the one that succeeds. Make yourself look good. It's even an interview question, right? Talk about a situation where you led a team and doing, those types of things. We're very, very good at doing it. Kelly says Doeg is framing what he witnessed to his benefit, not necessarily seeing everything that happens. This picture he painted allowed him to become more important to Saul. Yeah, and ultimately that's not going to last either. In the grand scheme of things. Isn't it amazing, though, how much we think we're setting ourselves up, but when we're just trying to puff ourselves up, sooner or later we're going to come across a pin that's going to poke and destroy us in a lot of different ways, right? Like that's always part of it. And we miss the added benefit. Sarah, you talked about that a little bit. It allows us to maybe witness to that person better if we know what they're going through or their background. Yep, absolutely. It allows us to help people understand each other more as well if we're people that put the best construction on things. And realistically, what happens when we start putting the best construction on things is people start seeing us as trustworthy too, don't they? They start seeing us as someone that actually can be believed because they are constantly feeling like we have their back. Beth says, what would the best construction from Doeg have looked like? Yeah, that's a really, really great question. A really great question. A best construction from Doeg might have looked like, I've seen David. He was at Nob. He was running for his life and things like that. I heard him talk to the priest. This is what he said, telling him exactly what he said in a lot of different ways and saying, the priest didn't know, but I have to ask, maybe Doeg didn't know this, but Doeg could say, hey, David has not betrayed you before in the past. Why is he running from you? Why is this a thing? And yet Doeg could be taking his own life into his hands at that point in time as well. There's also a conversation here around if it's not going to help anything, and it's only going to destroy things, maybe it's better left unsaid, at least for the moment. That could be another possible conversation when it comes to Doeg. But telling the truth is what really comes out. Telling the truth is what really comes out. No one asked Doeg to report, though, what he saw. No one asked for a report about where David was. Notice, this does not come up when Doeg actually sees David and then comes back. David has gone to Moab. David has gone off in a cave. David is now in the forest, and Saul is freaking out, and this is when Doeg says it. And so maybe even just reporting it when it happened could have been a little bit different. But at the exact same time, yeah, maybe it's better left simply unsaid in this situation, because the best construction is that Saul is not going to understand this for what it was. And if Saul's not going to understand it for what it was, maybe I keep it to myself. That could be a conversation as well. Willie says, in our lives today, especially in our current climate, we ascribe worst intentions and motives to beliefs and principles others, and the best intention and motives to our beliefs and principles. Yeah, absolutely. That's a perfect way of putting it, right? We ascribe worst intentions and motives to the beliefs and principles of others, and the best intentions and motives to our beliefs and principles. Absolutely. And the question, of course, is then, where's that happening in your life, right? It's one of those things, and I do this as well, and I did it in my sermon this weekend as well too. Like, it's really easy to point it out and just say, our world is this way. And then wrestling with, where am I adding to that? Needs to be a part of the conversation as well. Kelly says, a rising tide lifts all boats, but so much in a society is focused on the individual. I would say so much in our society is focused on the individual, because that is something that is very, very unique to A, the Western world, but B, the United States of America more than anything. It really does feel so much better to support people and see them positively. And yet, one of the reasons why we struggle with it so much is because when you are supporting people, it feels like you lose as well. Because notice, Doeg is getting noticed by Saul now. If he wouldn't have spoken up, because he would have decided that Saul wouldn't have been able to understand, does he get that benefit? No. Technically, he loses a little bit, right? And so there's a little bit of love and sacrifice in order to do that. To put the best construction on everything means that we lose a little bit. Now, some of us would say we never had that to begin with, because God had not given it to us. We are illegally grabbing things that were not given to us by not putting the best construction on things. It definitely is something, though, to wrestle with, because you're absolutely right. In a lot of different ways, it does feel so much better to support people and see them positively. The question ultimately becomes, how much are you losing? And where's your line? Because we all have one in a lot of different ways, right? Which is the reason why we look out for ourselves. It's the reason why we don't put the best construction on all things anyways, because we're looking out for ourselves. We're thinking about ourselves. We want to protect ourselves and benefit ourselves in a lot of different ways. Yeah, we're going to go on here. Gotta go back to my slides. We're going to go on here and read the final verses of this chapter. And we're going to see how this plays out in the end. Hint, it's not even a little bit good. So, King Saul immediately sent for Ahimelech and all of his family who served as priests at Nob. When they arrived, Saul shouted at him, "Listen to me, you son of Ahitub." "What is it, my king?" Ahimelech asked. "Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me?" Saul demanded. "Why did you give him food and a sword? Why have you consulted God for him? Why have you encouraged him to kill me as he is trying to do this very day?" "But sir," Ahimelech replied, "is anyone among all your servants as faithful as David, your son-in-law? Why he's the captain of your bodyguard and highly honored member of your household. This was certainly not the first time I consulted God for him. May the king not accuse me and my family in this matter, for I knew nothing at all of any plot against you." "You will surely die, Ahimelech, along with your entire family," the king shouted. And he ordered his bodyguards, "Kill the priests of the Lord, for they are allies and conspirators with David. They knew he was running away from me, but they didn't tell me." But Saul's men refused to kill the Lord's priests. Then the king said to Doeg, "You do it." So Doeg the Edomite turned on them and killed them all that day, 85 priests in all, still wearing their priestly garments. Then he went to Nob, the town of the priests, and killed the priests' families, men and women, children and babies, and all the cattle, donkeys, sheep, and goats. Only Abiathar, one of the sons of Ahimelech, escaped and fled to David. When he told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord, David exclaimed, "I knew it. When I saw Doeg the Edomite there that day, I knew he was sure to tell Saul, 'Now I have caused the death of all your father's family. Stay here with me, and don't be afraid. I will protect you with my own life, for the same person wants to kill us both.'" Kind of a dark end to the chapter, as we really see Saul kind of fall off in a lot of different ways. So Saul orders Ahimelech and all of his household to be brought before him. He calls Ahimelech son of Ahitub. That's the other memorable name, by the way. And it's in Hebrew, it's probably a whole lot more of Ahituv. But Ahitub is the way that I learned it as a kid. And so that's just what I remember. It's another one of those random names. Instead of by his name, it's a very common thing that Saul does. Maybe you've been capturing it along the way. Saul, when he's enemies with someone, does not call them by their name. He calls them son of their father. Remember, calling people by their names showed favor at this time, so your name was part of your status in a lot of different ways. Saul is not giving someone their status by calling them by their name. Saul asserts that Ahimelech is conspiring against him, which is not true, and that now David is lying in wait to ambush him, which is also not true, right? We're more and more on in the craziness of this whole entire account. Ahimelech responds very much the way that Jonathan has in the past. He points to David's loyalty, right? Notice the difference. Saul has proved himself inconsistent enough for David to flee, and yet David has been consistent the whole entire time, and Saul has assumed the worst. Like, it's backwards. The whole entire way, it's backwards. Saul is the one that should be singled out as the one being inconsistent here. Not only does Ahimelech say that he's inquired of the Lord for David in the past, so why should he stop now, right? He hasn't heard of anything about it. He also pleads ignorance on both cases. Notice that. So he pleads ignorance on one side by saying, I didn't know anything about a conspiracy, which is true. He's saying, you can't tell me that I'm liable for this because I had no idea that it was going on. And I also had no idea how David was wrapped up in things because he didn't tell me either. Ahimelech can plead ignorance on both sides of this coin. Moreover, though, Ahimelech challenges Saul to name someone more loyal than David. And that really is, when we talk about putting the best construction of things, if Doeg would have spoken, this had to be a part of it. Because that's what everybody else that speaks about about David properly does. Jonathan is the living example of this. Every single time Jonathan goes to bat for David with his father, he just says, name someone who's more loyal. Because Saul can't do it. There is nobody who's more loyal than David. It's only David in a lot of different ways. He's the upstanding guy. Saul completely ignores it, right? Because if Saul answers that question, the whole entire castle that he's building falls down. And he just simply demands that Ahimelech and all of his family be put to death. He's the priest. His family are priests. Absolutely unacceptable, to say the least. Saul's officers refuse. This is a very key difference. Some of you talk about, like, how does God allow people to get away with sin and not Saul, right? Some of you have said, how come God, this was 2 weeks ago, how come God doesn't react to David's fear as strongly as he did with Saul's? It's because this is where Saul's heart is. Remember, all the way back in the beginning, when Samuel is waiting to anoint the next king of Israel, and he sees all of these grand sons of Jesse, and he thinks that it might be any of them, but really it's the scrawny David guy who's out with the sheep. And he tells Samuel, God doesn't see things the way that humans see things. Humans look at the outward appearance. God looks at the heart. All the while, Saul's heart was completely and totally clear to God. All the while. And it was never towards God. In the grand scheme of things, it never really seemed like it was towards God. And it plays out almost immediately, again and again and again and again and again. And in this moment, Saul shows his complete disrespect for and ignorance towards God. The officers, his own officers, who he trusts, who fight for him, who are standing around him and all these things, his very own officers refuse to touch the priests. They are not playing that game. They're not interested. It doesn't matter who is demanding that they do this. They have too much respect for God. They have too much fear for God and the priestly office. They don't want that blood on their hands. Saul doesn't care. Saul doesn't care. Yep, Keith says it. Saul knew Ahimelech inquired of the Lord, and the Lord helped David. Therefore, Saul is going directly against God. Yep, and this is what it all boils down to. That's why I said this is a very, very tipping point type chapter, because Saul absolutely shows that the whole entire war, the whole entire time, has never been against David. It's been against God. And the only person that can be blamed for that war is Saul. And I'll tell you why in a minute. Saul moves on to Doeg, likely for two reasons. He's already an Edomite, okay? So he's already proved himself to be loyal, and he's an Edomite, and he likely doesn't have the same respect for the priests that the officers do. They're just religious officials, okay? That's one of the big reasons why he moves on to Doeg. The priests don't fight back. 85 die before Saul, and the prophecy spoken against Eli's house all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 2 comes to pass. If you want to jump back to 1 Samuel chapter 2 with me, you can absolutely do that, or you can just listen to me read from 1 Samuel chapter 2. This is all the way at the end of the chapter, or at least towards the end of the chapter, at verse 27. A warning from Eli for Eli's family. Samuel is still a boy at this point in time, right? It says, one day a man of God came to Eli and gave him this message from the Lord. I revealed myself to your ancestors when they were Pharaoh's slaves to Egypt. I chose your ancestor Aaron from among all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to offer sacrifices on my altar, to burn incense, to wear the priestly vest as he served me. And I assigned the sacrificial offerings to you priests. So why did you scorn my sacrifices and offerings? Why did you give your sons more honor than you give me? For you and they have become fat from the best offerings of the people of Israel. Therefore, the Lord, the God of Israel, says, I promise that your branch of the tribe of Levi would always be my priest, but I will honor those who honor me, and I will despise those who think lightly of me. If that doesn't describe Saul, I don't know what does. The time is coming when I will put an end to your family. He's talking to Eli the priest, so it will no longer serve as my priest. All the members of your family will die before their time. None will reach old age. You will watch with envy as I pour out prosperity on the people of Israel, but no members of your family will ever live out their days. The few not cut off from serving at my altar will survive, but only so their eyes can go blind and their hearts break, and their children will die a violent death. And to prove that what I have said will come true, I will cause your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, to die in the same day. Then I will raise up a faithful priest who will serve me and do what I desire. I will establish his family, and they will be my priest. They will be priests to my anointed kings forever. Then all your surviving family will bow down before him, begging for money and food. Please, they say, give us jobs among the priests so that we will have enough to eat. That was what was spoken against Eli. And so 85 die in this one time. Now, that doesn't excuse this. This is still not okay. Just because this was prophesied doesn't mean that it's okay, right? It's just the word of the Lord comes to pass, is the way that we should look at this. Again, though, this is what I was saying. We see Saul's true colors. Back in chapter 15, Saul failed to put to the sword everything of the Amalekites in accordance with God's command. Remember that? Samuel walks up to him and is like, what is this bleating of sheep and rams and things like that I hear? And Saul's like, oh, it's okay. We just kept the best stuff for ourselves. And I'm going to sacrifice it to God, right? Kind of this like very random statement. And Samuel calls him out on it. He didn't kill things then under the command of God. Now, rather than the anointed king obliterating a pagan nation, a pagan mercenary, that's Doeg, obliterates God's anointed priests. And not just the 85 that stood before him, all of their families and all of their stuff. Nob is pretty much reduced to ashes by Doeg. It's pretty rough. Nearly everyone dies but one son, Abiathar. This continues the fulfillment of the prophecy against Eli's house. It's going to be fully fulfilled by Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 26. I could get into that, but it gets very, very lengthy. Abiathar gets cut off as well, though, and it's part of the wisdom of Solomon in the early moves that he makes. Abiathar runs to David, who bears the weight of everything that's just happened. We get to see David play his cards a little bit. When I said, remember last time, we all kind of pondered, David doesn't tell the truth, right? I'm on this secret mission from the king, and I need a weapon, and I don't have any food, and things like that, right? And I said, well, maybe he's covering because Doeg the Edomite is there. Maybe he's covering. Maybe he's just hoping that Doeg doesn't report this back to the king, or if he does, he reports exactly what he saw. Doeg, of course, doesn't do that. David was thinking that in the back of his mind. We find that out now the whole entire time. It's noteworthy that we're beginning to see a different side of David, though. After a lower point in chapter 21, David is gaining confidence in God's presence with him. Maybe it's because of the interaction with Gad. Maybe it's because of the 400 men with him or something else like that. David now seems ready for whatever else is to come. Notice that. Stay here with me. This is what he tells Abiathar. Stay here with me and don't be afraid. I will protect you with my own life. For the same person wants to kill us both. That's a very, very kingly statement in the grand scheme of things from David. So, 2 questions for you. A common reaction to a chapter like this. This is the question that I would like to hear your thoughts on for sure. And then the second one is kind of just a very, very open question because there's so much that goes on in this chapter. But a common reaction to a chapter like this is grief and to ask why God would allow such a thing. It's a mess, right? Why would God allow such a thing? We know that evil doesn't come from God, but God allows it. And so why would God allow such a thing? If someone were to ask you today, why did God allow this? How might you respond? That's the first piece. And the second piece, there's a lot going on in this section. What stands out to you and why? I know that's kind of an overarching thing, but what stands out to you and why? What's really big to you about this chapter? Love to hear your responses to those questions. Cassie's pleading the fifth, which isn't a totally acceptable response, by the way. We see prophets do this all the time. And that is one of the ways to answer this question. What's God doing? Why does God allow this? We say, I'm dealing with someone above my station, and I'm dealing with something that is beyond my knowledge as a finite human being. I'm not God. I don't know. That definitely can be a way to respond. You could also maybe lean into that and say, like, I kind of wonder the exact same thing. However, it's important that the I'm not God, I don't know doesn't stop there. That we don't turn it into a past buck type of a thing. In a sense of like, oh, yeah, it's God and I don't understand those pieces. So I'm going to ignore that part and I'm going to choose the good part, right? Like that's not necessarily the impression either. It's we can absolutely say I'm not God, I don't know. But then there's the bigger thing too, like so some of what Bob and Sandy said could be filled in there as well. So this is a fulfilled prophecy. This was actually a punishment that God deemed against the family of priests because a very significant sin had taken place. And so we know why God allows them to die. Why it happens in this way, why it happens with Saul, why it happens with Doeg the Edomite, I don't really know all of those details, but it was bound to come to pass. God said that it was going to come to pass through his own prophet, right? So what do we do with all of this? How will we know if God's coming after us or not? Well, we go to the cross, right? So you can have a conversation like that as well. So it's fine to say, I don't know, because I'm not God. You want to push it further than that in a lot of different ways, though. You want to give some meat behind those bones. Otherwise, it sounds very much like we're just choosing. I'm not God. Not saying that's what you're doing, Cassie, but it very much can seem that way, right? Like, I'm not God. I'm just going to leave that stuff over there. Boom. And I'm going to choose the good parts of God. Aaron says, God didn't allow this. It was Saul's anger, still hardened and consumed. So it was pure sin that led to the death of those priests. Yes. Okay. So, you God, if God is absolutely God, he allows sin in this case, because otherwise he would just wipe everyone off the face of the earth, right? So there's like this weird, tricky. God's not the root of all evil, and yet why does he allow sin? It's out of his greater love for us, type of a thing. Like we're getting into the hidden things of God. So that's definitely another way, though, is you can say God didn't allow this. Saul just did it, right? So instead of making it seem like God's like, yeah, I'm just going to throw a little evil into things, right? Like you're cooking a stew or something, and God just, yeah, here you go, spritz some evil in that. Let some priests die and things like that. Like that's not what's going on. God's not doing that in a sense. And you're absolutely right, Aaron. This is another way that you can respond, is to call sin exactly what it is and to highlight where sin is actually found. And so to say, dude, it's Saul. Like, why are you concerned so much about God in this? It's the exact same thing. When God's people get taken off into exile, their initial reaction is to like throw their fists at God and say, God, why did you allow such of a thing? And the prophets are all like, hold on. Didn't you turn your backs on God, Israel? Like, didn't you wander away from him? And now you're wondering why you're in exile? Like, look at yourself. So yeah, you're right in there, Aaron. I want to say God was definitely aware that this happened, but Saul is still king, technically. Yeah, call sin what it is and call it out for where it is. Yeah, absolutely. Kathy says, God is working in the background and will take care of things. He doesn't expect us to understand, but to trust that he is taking care of it. Yep, that can definitely be an answer. Generally, it's an answer that seems fairly unsettling. I would be like, okay, so how do I know that God's going to take care of things, right? It leads to a further question. There's a very, very good question that you can respond with first and foremost if someone asks you this question, by the way. You get extra points if you also know what that question might be. But yeah, so Kathy, your response could be one that leads to a further question, right? So God's working in the background. He's going to take care of all things. He doesn't expect us to understand, but trust that he's taking care of it. Well, how do I know that I can trust God to take care of it and that he's taking care of all things? And how do I know that it's going to be okay with me, right? Yeah, Kathy, easier said than done, right? But that's the further question, right? Is how do I know that is true for myself? That's the bigger thing that's in there. Dan says David takes responsibility for the priest's deaths. He doesn't pass the blame. That's a big thing that jumps out to you. Yeah, totally. So that was kind of from last time. We were like, well, hold on. It seems like David is just hanging things out there. David's not hanging things out there. He takes total responsibility. He doesn't pass the blame, even though it's Saul's fault and Doeg's fault, right? David still takes responsibility. That's a big thing. A bunch of you guys are moving on to question number 2. I'm going to throw one more thing on question number 1 before I kind of wrap that up. If someone were to ask you why God allows this, a really good place to start is, why do you want to know? I know it's super annoying to answer a question with a question, but it will help you know what your response is. Because if someone says, why would God allow such a thing? They could just be saying, this is the problem that I have with religion or the Bible or something else like that. Is there all this bad stuff while you call God good? How do I get around that? How can you say that this type of God is good? They could be saying like, I'm no better than Saul. How do I know that God's not going to do this to me one day? Right? If you ask the question, why do you want to know? It invites the person to lay their cards on the table, which allows you both to be honest in your response and in their question. Because, yeah, it's a good question, but tell me more, right? Like, why is that a thing? That's always a good response. If you don't know what to say and someone asks you a really big question, ask why they want to know. That's always a really good thing to do. Jumping back into question number 2, though, Beth says, the further Saul moves from God, the worse his action becomes. That stands out. Yeah, isn't that amazing? Because more and more, we are created to, and as human beings, because we are finite, we have to have a God. We have to have a God. Even the people that claim to not have gods have a God. And they can disagree with me all that they want to. They have a God in something. We all have something that we trust in, lean in, hope in. And the reality is that the further you drift away from God, the further something else is going to set itself up in opposition to God. Right? And so by saying the worse his actions become, because the God that Saul chooses for himself is himself and his power. And those are the two things that are slipping away. So it's not surprising to see how his actions become. Cassie says, you always say that we cannot unmask the hidden God. Yeah, that's a good comment. Not that you can't unmask the hidden God. Maybe the better thing is we shouldn't. And by saying shouldn't, I'm not saying in a law-based way, like how dare you unmask the hidden God. The hidden God is Martin Luther's term to saying there are certain things that are beyond us, and how God works in the midst of sin and evil, how he allows it, how he orchestrates things to work for good in the midst of that, how like pandemics can happen, how world wars can happen. Yes, they are all connected to human sin and worldly brokenness and all this stuff. We know that, but how God relates to all of those things, and how does God decide to condemn people in some cases? How does he cut people off in others? Why does he choose some and not others when you look at the Old Testament? All of those things, well, some of them, all of them have explanations to them. All those comments have explanations to them. But sooner or later, we're going to butt up against the fact that we're trying to explain away or just define all of the things of God that we just do not know. And so when I say unmasking the hidden God, it's literally me saying, sometimes we just got to leave the hidden things of God as the hidden things of God, because the more that we dig into them, Luther would say, the more that we fall into despair, the more that it freaks you out because you're afraid that God's coming after you. You stop looking at Jesus and you start wondering all of the what if questions. I would also say that what we end up doing when we unmask the hidden God is we end up over defining God, and we make God in our own image instead of God being in his own image. Kathy says, I agree with Dan. David is taking accountability for this. Yep. Sarah says, I don't know, but probably back then people lived much more at the mercy of the relevant king. Their lives were at the king's whim in a sense, but yes, fulfilled a prophecy, and we don't know God's ultimate plan. Yeah, so that's the common reaction on what would you do? Yep. That's another good response. This one is also on question 1. Kelly says, God may have allowed these atrocities, so that people can see the extreme failings of putting a human king above God, and what happens when we as humans think that any one person is so wonderful. Yeah, so Kelly puts it in our own context, which again shows you all of the different reasons why someone could ask this question. Someone could be like, why is this included in the Bible, right? And Kelly says, well, maybe God allowed this to be included in the Bible so that we can see the extreme failings of putting a human king above God. Don't do it. Right? We get to see this fairly clearly. Yeah, another great way to respond. Kelly says, maybe you're preparing us for the perfection of the Anointed One. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Let's see here. Sandy says it shows Saul's heart and the ugliness of sin. Kathy says, yes, easier said than done. Yeah, we can know that we can trust in God, as we know when we look back at our lives. Look back in our lives and see how he's worked in the trials that we faced. Yep, absolutely. Aaron says, what stands out to me is that Doeg completely turns on pride and glory for himself and kills innocent priests, something like that. Yeah, that would stand out to me as well. That definitely stands out to me. Keith says, tough pill to swallow, that infants die because their great-grandfather Eli honored his sins more than God, or his sons more than God. Both are true in that sense. But none of us deserve another day on this earth because of our sin. Yeah, man, that's hard, right? Because that's where it gets into the struggle. That's when we really get into the hidden God. It's like, why would God allow such a thing like that? How does that make sense? Because it doesn't make sense in a lot of different ways, right? And when we try to sort it out, we're going to end up with an answer that A, we don't know is true, and B, is probably going to be very unsatisfying because we're not God. Todd says, I find the parallel with Jesus interesting, as those distressed, in debt, and discontented became followers of David. Followers of Jesus were also the malcontents in need of a leader, a.k.a. a savior, which, yeah, totally goes back to Cassie's earlier comment on this wasn't the end of the first section. Like, if he's a man after God's own heart, it's no wonder why those types of people came to David. Yeah, absolutely right. Willie, I'm not sure if there's something that happened weird or something else like that. Your last 2 comments have been retracted. So I can't see them for some reason. Maybe there's something wrong with my computer. It's only you that I'm seeing getting messages retracted. I hope I'm not missing something. but they just like blipped up and then they both got retracted right away. So they got deleted, or at least that's what it's telling me. So I hope it's okay. Sarah says, totally random comment, but I was thinking at the beginning how Jesse's line is attacked more than once in the Bible, like Herod killing the babies, David's line here trying to be wiped out. Oh, yeah, and it's going to happen a lot more times in the Old Testament. There's a ton of significant things that happen trying to wipe out the line of King David. It's very much, and this could be the bigger picture here, is when Paul says our battle is not against flesh and blood, it's against the unseen forces in the world and things like that. That definitely could be part of the conversation here as well, is that Satan is going to stop at nothing to try to destroy things in a lot of different ways. It's a mess in a lot of different ways. God continues to move his promise forward, no matter the sin, no matter the attack or anything else like that. It's pretty astounding in the grand scheme of things. I know it is 4:05, and so I'm going to ask this question now. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Some of them might have come out already, and that's fine. My voice made it. Woo! But what's your big takeaway from 22? I'm going to read this in case it deletes itself. I don't know. We don't know why, how, why, and when God chooses to stop the consequences of sin, both Saul's and ours. God's knowledge of the big picture of history is different than ours. Yes. Okay. So that's another way of putting it. It's just saying, like, God's knowledge, God sits outside of time and space. He is not confined by our finiteness in any sort of way. And so, not being confined by our finiteness, and you see these weird verses that talk about how, like, 1,000 years are like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years to God, and things like that. Like, all of a sudden, we're in this very, very weird loop of time, and it almost makes your head hurt a little bit to try to wrap your mind around all of it and figure it out. And we have this promise in the end that people will look at God and say he has done all things well, right? That we'll be able to at least understand enough of the bigger picture that we say, oh, I get it now, right? But we're not on that side of eternity. We can't see the bigger picture. And so pleading the fifth is a very, very good thing sometimes. Kelly says, seeing the parallels of David and Jesus as who became David's soldiers, and that David takes the responsibility of the deaths of so many. Yeah, seeing the parallels of David and Jesus as who became David's soldiers, and that David takes the responsibility of the deaths of so many. Yeah, it's a big thing. It's a big thing to stand out. And then always the question is, like, what are you going to do with that, right? If that's the thing that stands out to you, maybe it's, I'm going to look for more parallels and things like that. Maybe things are not as detached as I thought they would be, or whatever else. Maybe it's just wrestling with the fact that we are finite. Going back to Willie's comment, maybe it's just wrestling with the fact that we're finite. And God, teach me how to number my days so that I might gain a heart of wisdom, right? That's a scriptural comment as well. Remind me of my finiteness, so I might not think more of myself than I ought. Or I might not think more of this life than I ought. Or I might not think less of you than I ought. Right? You can answer any of those, or you can fill in the blank with any of those questions as well. Sarah says, and that mindset also helps us answer the question, like, why would God do that? Yeah. Right? When we see so many different people attacking God's promise, and we don't see the hidden spiritual battle going on. Job is a big context in this as well, right? You look at Job, and it starts with this whole entire conversation between God and Satan. And the big thing that I continue to go back to is that Job never knows that. Even though everything is given back to Job, we never get the comment that God told Job that one day Satan and I were talking, right? Like, Job never gets to hear that. He just gets blessed. And the suffering ends. But he gains a heart of wisdom. All the more in the process. Let's hear from a few more of you, though. What's your big takeaway from 1 Samuel 22? What are you going to do with it because of the takeaway? Curious to hear what your answers are. Keith says, my takeaway is always to put the best or correct construction on everything, even if it makes me look bad. And that's hard. Yeah. That's absolutely hard. Kelly says, I think this brings me to have more conversations and reflections with God. Uh, and then be silent and keeping my heart open for what answers God whispers. Yeah, having more conversations and reflections with God and then being silent. Receiving from God. This is one of the things that uh, I've had a number of different conversations in the past couple of weeks about this. How much people have just said, you know what, I read, and I'm not feeling like God is speaking to me. And while I don't know every single situation, so I'm not claiming to know the answer in how to respond in each and every case, you hear so much, read the Bible, that we sometimes wait to just, it's the James thing. Don't just merely read the word, do what it says, right? Receive the word, ponder the word, sit with the word. Just let yourself be filled by it. Ponder it, contemplate it, things like that. Receive from God. Listen for God's voice and consider what you hear when you actually hear the scriptures. Not saying that none of us do that. I'm just saying sometimes we read and don't think to listen too much as well. Dan says, takeaway, don't hang around with anyone named Doeg. Badum. Yeah, you make it for that one. That's now going to be Aaron's takeaway and Beth's takeaway. And Kathy is laughing on the side. Yeah. That can definitely can be a takeaway as well. Anything else though that you're taking away? I know that a few of you are still on. I'm pretty sure if I have to pull up my counter on my phone, but this is the way that I kind of get around things, is I get to see who's still around. Yeah. So I'm showing over 20 people are still around right now, or are still watching right now. So I want to hear from you. Especially if I haven't heard from you yet. And look at that. Bob and Sandy and Diane comment right away. There you go. Bob and Sandy says, to be armed with the question, why do you ask when tough questions come up in conversations? Yes, and that is not mine. Oh, man, that's not mine. Robert Kolb, he goes by the name of Bob Kolb. He's this short little German man who does not own a TV or anything else like that. He was a professor, actually, at Concordia in St. Paul for the longest time. He is the most recent translator of the most current Book of Concord, which is a collection of Lutheran confessional documents from the Reformation and things like that were written in Latin and in German, things like that. I had the extreme blessing to have him as a professor for both of my Lutheran confessions classes, my early Lutheran confessions classes before you get into deeper doctrine and things like that at the seminary. Bob Kolb was my professor, and Dr. Kolb is a truly amazing individual. But one of the things, he writes this book on sharing the gospel today, and he wrote it like back in the 90s, and I read it for his class, and it's amazing how even though our world has changed so much since the 90s, everything was still incredibly relevant, and he starts, like one of his very early things is to be armed with the question, why do you ask? Or why do you want to know? You know, those are two very good things, because he says, you know what, we assume too much. And so we don't know if we keep assuming things. And so, yeah, why do you want to know? It's a great question to have. Diane says, looking back to the things that that were tough in our lives and looking at where we are now helps us trust in the Lord, right? It reminds us of God's faithfulness. That's what it does. It reminds us of God's faithfulness. And it's so easy. We talked about it with Ruth this morning as well, right? When life gets hard, we get tunnel vision. We get tunnel vision. We get tunnel vision. So it's absolutely important that we have people around us who can remind us of the faithfulness of God. Keith says, also don't have anger like Saul. Man, we're going with big ones here today. Don't hang out with Doeg and don't have anger like Saul. So don't kill a bunch of priests and don't hang around with anyone like Doeg. No, I don't mean to like belittle your comments or anything else like that. Yeah, it's a very, very big one. And having people that can call out anger like that in our life, Keith, is very big as well. Beth says, what's the name of that book? Speaking the Gospel Today. Kolb is the last name, Kolb. Speaking the Gospel Today is the name of that book. Older book. I know it's been updated a couple times. I might even have an extra copy, Beth, that I might be able to give you. Let me check, and I can text you or something like that and find out. Todd says, my takeaway, leaders can either be good or bad. We need to look at their actions and not just their words to see where their heart lies. Yeah. Yep. And notice that God looks at, this is the big thing. We look at actions, we look at the outside, God looks at the heart. And all the more, this is really, really deep and complicated and hard sometimes when you take in politics and political opinions and everything else like that, that we so often take in our Western world. This is, I know, not where you're going, Todd, or maybe it is. I don't know. We need to pray that God would be showing us people's hearts, right? As people who elect our leaders and pray for them and everything else like that, pray that we would see hearts and we would see what things actually are in a lot of different ways, because it matters. The heart of a leader very much matters. Kelly says the "why do you ask" question works in so many ways. I keep forgetting to use it, but when you, it really can neutralize and open a conversation. Yeah, it's amazing, and people are shocked by it when you say that. It's almost like, whoa, hold on, because all of a sudden what it does is it communicates, I actually care about what you're asking, and I want to give you a really good answer, right? Yeah, so it's a great thing to say. It's a great thing to say. Why do you ask? Great thing to say. Amen, Todd says. Yeah, man, I'm preparing myself for November. I know it's just starting. And I know that's the biggest election and things like that, but there's a lot of other elections going on. Pray for your leaders. You're commanded to do that. We're commanded even to pray. Paul talks about praying for leaders even when leaders were killing Christians. But pray that we would see people's hearts and look for people's hearts. That matters. That matters. Don't get caught up in the paranoia, for sure. Chris says, it never ceases to amaze me how God puts everything together. He knew it from the beginning that David would be kind and that Jesus would come from the line of David. There are many twists and turns in between, but God makes it all good. I need to remember that God has it all under control. Yep, absolutely, Chris. And that's super, super hard. Super hard. Ron says that too, right? God has his own timeline. Yep. Yeah. And it's really, really easy when life is okay, right? God has his own timeline. When it's interesting, I've been talking about this with a couple of people as well. Some people are like, I just don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. And it's interesting, right? Because none of us have ever known what tomorrow is going to bring. It's just accented now because we truly feel like everything is outside of our control. But remembering that God is in control, being reminded that God is in control, noticing where God is in control, that matters a lot and is very encouraging as well. Willie says, my biggest takeaway is learning that unless someone explicitly tells me why they believe what they believe, I need to stop ascribing bad motives or intentions to them. Whew. Yeah, that's big. That's big. Thanks for sharing that one, Willie. I think that's really where I've been leaning with things as well, is I get really, it's really easy for me to do the exact same thing. To dive into that, to just assume the worst instead of assuming the best. Yeah, and you see just how destructive it really can be. Doeg's an extreme example, but we get to see just how destructive it can be. So it matters. It matters. I'm sharing with that takeaway, Willie, so thanks for sharing that. Kelly says, thank you. I pray for my leaders and they have a heart for God, that they have a heart for God, but praying that I see their hearts is a different thing, and I can't wait to see how that leads. Yeah, that's the fun part about praying new things, right? You get to expectantly look out and see how God works. It's 4:18. Wow, we had a lot of conversation today. It was like 4:05 when I said, yay, my voice held through, and then I talked for another 15 minutes. So, yeah, if you want to, it's kind of a prideful thing, but if you want to pray for my voice, I got more preaching to do earlier this week, because some people are on vacation and stuff like that, so I got to record sermons for this weekend early. Just pray that my voice stays strong and things like that. Using it a lot recently. You go from not using it a bunch to using it a lot. Tie in allergies and all that stuff too. It gets real fun, as some of you know. But yeah, thanks for spending part of your Sunday with me. I'm going to close us with a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you for being in control over all things. Thank you for being God, both showing your goodness and doing things in your knowledge and understanding that we do not understand, even when it makes us frustrated. You promise that it's for our good, and we pray that we would see that and recognize that and believe that. God, you know what we're facing today. You know the things that weigh heavy on our hearts and minds, and I pray that you would encourage us by your Holy Spirit, that you would encourage us through your word, that you would speak to us, lead us in listening to you, God, for your glory. Thanks for this time. Bless us this week. Help us to see you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Soap Guy says, love these times together. So do I, man. So do I. Yeah, now that we're doing Sunday mornings, definitely more tired in the afternoon on Sundays, but man, I will do this as long as I possibly can. It's a lot of fun. Helps with all the conversation and everything else like that. Aaron says, amen, will do, bro. Thank you. Absolutely, Ian. Absolutely. Side note, Kathy says, thank you. Some of you guys know that I like rap and hip-hop music. Side note, I don't know why Aaron's comment made me think about it. One of my favorite Christian rap artists, Lecrae, Lecrae, is dropping a new album, and I've heard a couple of the songs on it already, and it's amazing. It's amazing. Speaking of what's going on in our world and stuff like that right now. And so if that is a style of music that you're interested in, if that's something that you're interested in, go check it out. It's pretty sweet. Willie, Aaron, dude, we should go catch Lecrae sometime. He's unreal. But yeah, his new album is very sweet and has given me a lot of words to things that I've been feeling, wrestling with, praying over. And so, yeah, it's been a blessing to me. Wanted to share that with you guys. But the chat box will be open for a little while. I'm going to close down the stream. Otherwise, though, thank you for spending part of your Sunday with me. Be blessed. I will see you next week.